Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Andidion Gokon, or you can call me Andy, and I am the Community and Capacity Building Manager at Open Contracting Partnership. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat, and we have also shared a notes document in the chat section that you can fill out your details. So with today's webinar, our previous webinar, we've had a series of webinars on OCDS extensions. We started off with using OCDS extensions, and today we're going into how to create the extensions. Our previous webinar was designed for everyone interested in implementing OCDS without many requirements for technical knowledge. But today's webinar is the technical one. And it does assume that you're either familiar with the OCDS schema or you have advanced knowledge of it, meaning that you should be familiar with its fields, principles, structures, and code lists. So we presume that if you're here, you're familiar with the OCDS extensions mechanism, which we covered in our previous webinar. And you can also find a video of the recording of that webinar linked in our call notes. So getting into it. Our overall aim today is to provide an overview of how you can develop an OCDS extension. And to achieve that aim, we have the following objectives: that participants understand the resources and support available to them when they are developing an extension. Participants will also know and have an overview of the steps involved in developing an extension. And finally, participants are introduced to how developing an extension looks in practice through a demo. So we'll be having a demonstration today. And the target length of today's session is about 45 minutes, and we'll leave room at the end of the session for any questions. We're going to start off with a recap of the previous webinar on using OCDS extensions, and then we will work out, and then we'll get into the details of introducing you to the process of creating an extension. So we'll first walk you through discussion and design, and then the development stage, and then the documentation stage, finally demonstrating and testing stage. And then we'll give you a demonstration of how straightforward it is to create and enable an OCDS extension, given the above, before we finished with a summary Q&A, as well as our post-event survey. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Matt, to take us into our session today.
Thank you very much, Andy, and a wonderful introduction. So firstly, Andy is right. This webinar is mostly for technical people. If you're sitting there and you're not technical, there's still some lessons to be taken away if you're going to be the one communicating with your technical team. And to sort of like ground this in the OCDS extensions mechanism, I wanted to do a very quick recap of what was introduced in the last webinar. So the first kind of encounter that most people have with an OCDS extension, or the concept of extensions in OCDS, is really in the mapping process. And mapping is where you are identifying which data elements within your data sources match the ones that are in OCDS fields and which OCDS codes that you're going to be using. Some data might not match a field or a code in OCDS. So in order to cover these cases and make sure you're not just throwing the data out, you should be using extensions to add extra fields and add extra codes to OCDS. And what these extensions do is that they provide a way to make sure that these additions are well documented and well defined, as well as defining validation rules for them. And what that means is that you can check that you're populating these correctly. And if the extension is reusable by other people, it means that they can validate their data against it as well. It also, a lot of the OCDS tools are mechanical, and they automatically read extensions. So it declares those fields available for data users and tools to make use of as well, whether they're analyzing them or performing some other sort of calculations on the data. And the way you determine whether you need to use an OCDS extension is by engaging with the OCDS field level mapping process, which is actually supported by our field level mapping template. And the first thing you do is you identify data that maps to the core OCDS schema. And we're not even thinking about extensions there. But next you should see the fields in your data that are kind of left over and that map to a recommended extension. And these are actually documented in the field level mapping template itself as well. And then you should explore that via the Extensions Explorer to see what the documentation's like. And we'll see some examples of that upcoming in this webinar. And then finally, if you've still got data left over that doesn't map to either the core schema or or an existing OCDS extension, you should be using the Extensions Explorer to discover other extensions that might apply. And then if you still have data left over that doesn't map to anything else, so you can't map it to an existing OCDS field and you can't map it to an existing OCDS extension, then you should get in touch with the help desk and we'll support you with what to do going forward. This webinar is a kind of first step in that support. But you should still get in touch with us anyway, so that we're aware of what you're trying to do and that we can help you achieve it. Mechanically, and sort of speaking in data terms, extensions are declared in the package metadata for the releases and records. And this actually just involves editing a single line in your JSON, although obviously you'll then need to add in the fields and the extension and the codes and the objects that your extension actually adds as well. Those do need to be populated. It's unfortunately not that simple. The extensions array is just a list of URLs. Usually we host extensions on GitHub, although all that it is required mechanically is that all of the files are publicly accessible at the URL that you give. So let's kind of dive in now that we've set the groundwork about what creating an extension really involves. The first big question that you usually ask when developing an extension is whether you need to actually do it at all. And I know that's kind of a bit weird to be presenting at the start of a webinar about creating an extension, but a lot of the time people do jump the gun. Creating extensions comes into play when you are absolutely sure that you can't model your data using core OCDS or an existing extension. If your data cannot be mapped to an existing extension, then we encourage you as a publisher to collaborate with others who might need to represent the same information. And those others are likely to be similar to you in terms of scale, locality, or specialism. So a good example is if you are a local authority or a local government and you're publishing OCDS within a particular country, you might want to contact other authorities in your country or other local governments. It might be a state government, it might be sort of a municipal government within your country or within your context to see if they're doing something similar, whether they've got an OCDS project and whether you can collaborate on an extension there. And before deciding to create your own extension, you should be searching our GitHub for both open and closed issues in the OCDS standard issue tracker. And this is just to make sure that nobody's kind of already working on a related extension. And if they are, you should consider getting in touch with them in order to collaborate with them. You'll be helping them as much as they'll be helping you if you're a new use case for that. If you're unsure of how to get in touch with that particular member of the community, then just get in touch with the help desk and we're happy to facilitate that for you. And if you can't find anyone, if you think that this problem hasn't been sort of encountered before, then you should consider sending a message to the OCDS mailing list to sort of solicit interest and see if anybody else has been thinking about this behind closed doors, because the more that people talk about the problems, the better collaborations that we can build in the OCDS community. Technically, to develop an extension, you will need an understanding of how to write JSON schema and an understanding of the underlying structure of the OCDS schema, which is actually written in JSON schema. Extensions are effectively just fragments of JSON schema, which are then merged into the core OCDS schema to create an extended schema file. And the standard extension template describes the structure and components of an extension and the technical steps to publish that extension. And we also provide an extension creator to actually support you generating the schema patch. So although you should have a base understanding of JSON schema, you don't need to have an advanced one, as we provide tooling for you that will help you actually write the JSON schema itself. So you might not even need to like sit down and write it just by yourself in a text file. When we discuss creating an OCDS extension, you'll hear us talk about the 4 Ds quite a lot. And these are a discussion stage where you engage with the OCDS community, where you determine the use cases and the motivations for your extension, the shape of the extension, so kind of like what it's roughly going to look like, what kind of fields and objects are you talking about, and then you should be iterating on potential designs. Then you have the development stage where you're actually engaged in creating the extension, and you are applying the models that you've come up with to OCDS design patterns. Then you have documentation, which in my opinion is one of the more important steps. And that's where you support the users of your OCDS data and potential other publishers who might want to use your extension with thorough documentation that is clear and concise. And then finally, the demonstration and testing stage. And that's where you produce sample data at various scales and of various validity to like check that your extension is behaving correctly, and making sure that when you apply it to your live data, that nothing unexpected is going to be happening when it's encountered by OCDS tooling. So I'm just going to take a quick second to drink some water. Let's dive into the first step of discussion. The first stage of the process is to discuss the idea for a new extension with others. OCDS actually benefits from quite an active community, and although we acknowledge every procurement context is unique, the reason OCDS exists at all is that we know there are common problems that are faced by people across the board. So the first thing you should do is to check our OCDS Extensions Explorer for extensions. Make sure you search it thoroughly, and you search using popular synonyms of words. Like, so instead of location, you could search for address, buyer, supplier, procurement entity. Make sure that you've covered all of the bases. And then after that, you can search our GitHub for issues, both closed and open. We can be found at github.com/open-contracting. And what you're trying to do here is basically unearth previous discussions that are around your problem, either directly related or tangentially related. So determine whether the advice in those discussion threads is applicable to you. Did they end up using an existing extension? So that maybe that's what you can do. Or did they end up developing an extension as a result of this? Was it very specific to their procurement context and could you use it? Or is it generic enough that that it's in the Extensions Explorer already? Maybe you didn't realize that there was an extension there that you could use. And finally, if you can't find a discussion that covers your problem, or if it's a bit of an ambiguous discussion, then you should just create an issue. And when you do create an issue, it's important to communicate clearly. This helps the OCDS team and the wider community engage with you, and it helps people in the future find this issue more easily when they're in your shoes and they're searching GitHub to determine if anybody else had the problem. So if you think about somebody who might have the same problem as you in a year or so, then you're kind of like doing them a favor by communicating clearly, because this will appear in their searching of GitHub if they're going through this process properly. So in your GitHub issue, when you start the discussion, you should include a description of the process that you're trying to represent. You should avoid too much detail about the data itself at this stage. Describe the workflow, the processes, and the types of information that people know at particular points in time. And a diagram might be useful to help or to link to if you've got it. And then you can bring in examples of existing data. So ideally, find 2 or 3 examples of how the data is currently represented in your system. And this is really to help with the actual modeling process when people and yourselves are going to be coming up with how to represent it in OCDS JSON. And the next stage is often like sort of the hardest for people, and that is to determine what belongs in OCDS and what can belong in a secondary data set that is referenced by OCDS. For example, budget and corporate information is better represented with beneficial ownership data. And transaction information is probably best represented with a separate transactions data set. There is actually an OCDS extension that can be used to like sort of link to individual transactions that are maybe separate from individual contracting processes. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're providing a description of what you believe the use cases are for this data. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. Like, part of this collaboration will be coming up with other potential use cases that you might not have thought of initially. But in particular, is there a strong use case for applying this in a way to compare between different localities or different countries? Is the main use case to create a common interface for different people who are using quite similar but like sort of maybe different language to like sort of map to? And this will, the reason that this is important is this informs the balance of the discussion between whether we're trying to build an interoperable, slightly abstracted data model, or whether it is just a case of making sure that your data as a publisher is best represented in like sort of an OCDS style of structure, but using language which is pretty close to your procurement locale. So I'm just going to give you a very quick demonstration of a very good GitHub issue that I found when preparing this webinar. And this is the problem space of needing to represent multiple buyers in an OCDS procurement. So Duncan, back in 2016, presented this issue where at the moment in sort of core OCDS, the buyer property is just a single object rather than an array. And which is great for most procurements, but we have some procurements which run contracting processes with multiple buyers. So Duncan has then presented some scenarios. He's an OCDS person anyway, so he's presented a possible solution. He's already thinking about different things, and then he's mapped that solution to different scenarios and how that would kind of manifest. And what this did was it started a discussion. It sparked off this discussion here. Lots of people kind of piled in to contribute. We started getting like sort of example data sort of modeled, and then like sort of the discussion kind of carried on in a very healthy way. And what that ended up doing is it actually resulted in the multiple buyers contract level discussion extension here. So this discussion, this initial problem that Duncan highlighted, ended up winding its way into the Extensions Explorer, and it's now applicable to quite a wide range of procurement contexts. So yes, practical tips for the discussion step are to always check the Extensions Explorer and the GitHub issues first. And if you're having this problem, then you'll spot this, and then you'll spot in the discussion, oh, there's an existing extension. And when you open a new issue, you need to be clear about your use case and be clear about your needs and how you're proposing to model them. If we think back to Duncan's issue, then he was very, very clear, very, very explicit about like sort of the problem that he was working with and the different use cases that he was encountering. And he got the community engaged, and sort of they were already on GitHub. But another good thing for you to do is to get engaged by contacting the OCDS mailing list. Like sort of, if you can't spot anybody with your problem, sound it out, get in touch, email the mailing list and be like, hey, has anybody encountered this problem before? Is anyone else working with this problem? And like sort of get in touch with the help desk team as well, and be prepared to collaborate. People can get quite protective, and rightfully so, about their extension if it's for their particular context. But if it's a problem that hits home with a lot of people, then they're going to want to have input as well. And the OCDS community, we're quite proud of it. It's very participatory, it's very collaborative, and we want to make sure that everyone is collaborating in a very healthy way. So if you're raising an issue about creating an extension, be prepared to collaborate with others. The next step in creating an extension is the development step, which is the step that most people get excited about. And it's where you'll actually begin implementing the extension itself. And this slide is really just set to show under the hood, what an OCDS extension is. It's ultimately a folder, usually a GitHub repository, which contains the following. It contains documentation, which explains the use cases for the extension, where and how to use the fields and codes. This is just in a README file. You have a JSON merge patch, which contains the actual extension code. This is the additions to the OCDS schema, the new rules, the new fields, the new codes that you've added, and those are applied to the extension. Most of the time, you'll be extending the release schema.json file. There are other schema files, such as the package schemas, but most of the extensions we found, unless they explicitly need to work with the packages, they work with the release schema file. And then there is an extension.json file as well that defines the extension, and it points all of the OCDS tools towards the other files, which are then applied to create your extension. So if you think back to that slide where I was showing you how extensions are applied with like the array and the array of URLs, that's the URL to this file is the one that's going to be included in people's OCDS data. If you're familiar with sort of development tools such as Composer, then it looks kind of similar to a Composer file. So even if you're familiar with JSON and if you're familiar with GitHub, it can be quite hard to get started. So JSON schema is a bit of a niche skill. So we've created some tools to help you. We have an OCDS extension template repository, which you can just fork and start using, or you can start using the extension creator, which actually provides a nice interface, which you'll see a little bit later in this webinar, to like sort of going through and developing the actual schema patch. Personally, I use a bit of a hybrid between the two. I find it easiest to fork the repo, clone it to my machine, and then I use the extensions creator to actually manipulate the schema patch. And then I use it to overwrite the one in the GitHub folder and then use that to track changes and push it up. I'll show you that kind of in action in a little bit, but these are not mutually exclusive tools, is the point that I'm trying to make. After creating the issue for your extension, you'll first need to decide on field names and structures. So like whether they're arrays, whether they're examples of other objects that already exist in OCDS potentially. And then after you've kind of done that, it's useful to start mocking up an example of the data that you're creating an extension for. You can mock it up, and you should be mocking it up in JSON and following OCDS design patterns. So how would different data fit into this structure? Does it hold up to all of the different sort of cases that you've got in your source system? Usability, are the field names intuitive for users? And structurally, is it easy for applications to consume, or they're going to have to store like quite a lot of references in memory that they might not want to? And at this stage, the more examples of source data and the more examples of different use cases for your data that you have, really the better, because the more that you can throw at it now, the easier it's going to be when it comes to like sort of develop the model and the final model and deploy it. And then once you've kind of got the idea of what your model is going to be, then you should be considering OCDS schema conventions. So we actually have an OCDS style guide, which we request that people developing extensions read and apply to their extension work. For example styles are, if you've got an array of objects in your extension, then you should absolutely have an ID property for each object. We've kind of learned, one of the things that OCDS is proud of is learning from other data standards, and other data standards in the past didn't have IDs for arrays, and that creates a lot of problems. So that's quite a big one. You should be using capitalized class names and camel case property names. And then especially if this is a community extension, or you're intending this to be a core extension, we request that English language is used for the field names. This is less important if it is a hyperlocal extension, but it's good practice to try and use a lingua franca with these things. And once you've settled on a model, ideally with the community feedback and ideally by consulting the OCDS handbook and style guide, then you should create the actual schema merge patch, which is usually done using the extension creator. Or if you're familiar, just bashing out some JSON schema, then you can do this manually using the extension template. So to quickly recap everything I've just said in like the form of practical tips, please make use of the tools that we've developed for you. They are incredibly helpful. I use them myself if I'm trying to get my head around something. It does make a big difference. Being aware of the OCDS style guide is a good thing as well. It's good practice to consult it as you go about developing your models and field names. Obviously, the earlier you consult it, the better, which means that you don't get like sort of deep down into your own model and then realize that, oh, it's not meeting the style. So doing that early on is a good thing. And then the final point, like on this stage, that I kind of want to make is that the OCDS help desk is still here to help you, when you're developing an extension. So get in touch with us early, get in touch with us often. If you're developing on GitHub and out in the open, then just tag us in the repository or tag us in the issue thread. We'll have spotted that anyway. Or you can just get in touch with us more discreetly via the OCDS help desk email, which is on screen now. We're absolutely happy to help. I give feedback on extensions multiple times a year. It's not particularly common, but it's not uncommon, not unheard of. We know what makes a good extension these days, and we can help you. And in building that community spirit is kind of what we're all about. The next step, which I said was kind of like my favorite step, it's kind of like my dual hated and favorite step, because writing good documentation is hard, but it's an important step for both users of your data, so people who are going to be encountering this data with the extension applied, and also potentially future publishers who have found your extension and decided that they kind of want to make use of it. If you're familiar with writing technical documentation, then the rules for good documentation apply here as well. The documentation should be clear, it should be concise. And the goal of this documentation is to make sure that implementers of your extension and users of your data know how it works. So you can do this by introducing the extension, by providing a short description of what it does, what's the motivation for it, and kind of what problem does it solve for you. Make sure you give clear definitions of each field that you've added, or reuse of objects. And this should align with the definitions that you provide in the actual schema file. And it's often best when reading about something new to see it in action. So including an appropriate amount of examples in the data using the extension, ideally situated in a use case, is good. If your extension is quite straightforward and quite tightly tied to one use case, this is going to be an easier task. If your extension is more broadly applicable and you've got people contributing different use cases, then documenting each of those is necessary, but it's going to require a bit more of a collaborative effort on your part. So let's take a look at an example extension on the Extensions Explorer to kind of see what I mean by good practice in documentation. So I've got here the bid statistics and details extension. It's quite a common one that we see applied quite often. So what it does is it starts off by basically situating the importance of including bids information. It's actually saying here are the different types of analysis that is that it enables. It enables different types of market analysis, red flag analysis for corruption risks, and value for money. Those are kind of like three of the big use cases for open contracting. So I can tell already that this is an important extension and that it's potentially quite applicable to my work and my publication. And it gives a little bit of background knowledge. And then it says, oh, I've introduced a new flexible top level section. And this is kind of the purpose of that. So before we've even gotten into all the fields, you've kind of got a flavor for what the shape of this extension is going to be and what you're going to be encountering, both as a user and as somebody who's looking to like apply this to their own JSON data. Then it gives a section where it actually goes through the different types of objects and fields that it adds to the schema. And then it finishes with some example data as well. And then the rest of this is kind of standard GitHub changelog and issues as well. So hopefully that kind of drives home the point of what good documentation looks like. And the practical tips for this step are to introduce and motivate it properly. And that's especially true if you're writing an extension that is designed to be reused. So the bids extension is quite broadly applicable to quite a lot of procurement contexts. Bidding is like sort of a core concept in procurement, but it also applies to your local extensions. If you've got an extension that's very specific to a publication that you're directly responsible for, you'll need to explain to data users like kind of how it works, what the motivation for this extension was, and you should make sure that the plain description fields are present in the documentation. They should be understood by somebody who isn't necessarily an absolute expert in a technical matter or the procurement expert. You should be kind of don't patronize people, but also make sure that you're not like using exclusionary or like kind of elitist language with regards to technical knowledge or procurement knowledge. Procurement is inherently technical. A lot of things are, but there are definitely ways that you can describe concepts to people that make them accessible. And at all stages, you should check the clarity and conciseness of your writing. I actually use a readability app. I'll quickly demonstrate it here. It's called Hemingway, and it highlights like sort of complex sentences and potentially big words, and kind of like the idea is to make all of those colors disappear. So I actually, when I write documentation, I copy and paste it in here, and then just like sort of check how I'm going and making sure that my writing is readable to a large number of people. And then another tip that I use is to read existing extension documentation. It's hard to, I'm sure everybody here and everybody watching this back on YouTube will be familiar with technical documentation, but I always like to kind of drive this home. If you're writing for OCDS for the first time, it's hard to build a table if you've never seen one before. So spend half an hour, even 20 minutes just reading other extension documentation. Go to the Extensions Explorer, find a recommended extension and kind of look at the practices that they have, not only the sections that they have, but kind of what specific paragraphs are doing. And that will like kind of guide you in writing good documentation specifically for OCDS extensions. And at this stage in the extensions creation process, a demonstration and testing, it's quite exciting. You actually get to put it to use before you deploy it live on your data, or you request it to be added to the extensions registry if it's more broadly applicable to others. If you're a technical audience, and I think everyone here is, then hopefully I don't need to drive home the importance of testing to you. But it is important to test before you deploy or release your extension, like kind of out in the wild for people to use. Following the process that we've outlined here, it will minimize the chance of errors, but you're a human being, I'm a human being. We make mistakes. I'm sure I've made lots of mistakes throughout this presentation. Testing means that you can catch even more of these mistakes and further reduce the risk of errors before deployment. The first thing you should do is host the extension so that all the URLs are publicly accessible. And in that kind of structure, the OCDS team, we have a preference for extensions that are hosted on GitHub. So that means that we can engage, the community can engage, but like theoretically speaking, they could just live on a web server somewhere. But we do recommend that you use GitHub. You should then declare the extension in some sample data, and then obviously implement the changes that the extension has in your OCDS schema, and making use of your new fields and code lists. And then you should upload this sample data to the data review tool. So the data review tool is built to handle OCDS extensions, as are many other OCDS tools. And it will detect whether your extension has been applied properly. If things are starting to appear as additional fields, then you know that something's gone a bit wrong. And you should also be checking that your validation rules are applied properly. And this is like something that a lot of people often forget in this process. There are two key elements to testing your extension. The first is that the structures, fields, and codes that you've added are usable in the data and are correctly declared. If they're not declared correctly and are being like sort of picked up as additional fields, then this means that there might be a problem with your schema patch. And secondly, if you've introduced new validation rules to your fields and structures, deliberately breaking them is a good thing. So it's no good, I mean, it does do good to test that your things work, but it's good to test that it will flag problems, and that's part of its function. And that's the reason we develop extensions. So deliberately break your data. If you've got data coming out of a test system, configure it to like get as much scope and coverage as possible. And then try substituting different data types. So instead of an object, just substitute a string. See if you can flag all these errors that you've got, like sort of really boil down what is my extension testing for, and then like how am I going to like sort of see this in action. And the more of this testing that you can do to tease out potential bugs, the better and more robust your extension will be when it is deployed in a live environment, and potentially deployed in multiple live environments in different procurement contexts. So the takeaway points here are really to one sec. To test your sample data to make sure your extension is being applied properly, and test that with data that you think should validate and data that you think should invalidate, to make sure that your rules are being applied properly. Use different data, try and break validation. You should consult the JSON schema website for tips on writing JSON schema. And during this process, we're like at the OCDS help desk, we're quite good at producing data that we think and breaking things and really running things through the mill. So you should just get in touch with us through our email address, and the help desk is absolutely happy to help you out during this process as well. So now I think it's best to run through a quick example of how to actually develop and deploy an extension. So I have a problem space here that I have defined, which is I need to model a tender with a predefined location. So that is often, sorry, Zoom is playing right funny buggers. That's a bit of an artificial one. We do see this in I think some African procurement contexts where a tender is tied to a specific location. But right here, kind of what I've ultimately tried to do is provide an example which will allow me to demonstrate something quite cool and demonstrate the use of the extensions creator in a particular way. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly stop sharing and then reshare so that you get everything that's going on in my screen. Everyone should be able to see that now. Can you still see my screen? Yes. It's not allowing me access to. There we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick up on some keywords here. So the keywords that I have are a tender with a predefined location. So that's kind of what I'm going to be basing my sort of first point of entry on. So using my knowledge, my existing knowledge of OCDS, I'm actually going to go to the standard documentation. I'm going to be looking at the release schema because that's kind of where tender is. And I know from being from working with OCDS day in and day out, and you'll know this as a publisher already, so don't worry, we're not like kind of presuming things that you might not have. I know that to model location there is an address field, so we can go to the release reference and have a look here. So this is an example of where somebody's included location data in an address. This is part of the OCDS schema. So it says to see address, and what this tells me is that there is an existing address model which I can reuse to kind of solve this problem. So that's kind of what we're going to do. Let's jump over to the extension creator. So this is the OCDS extension creator. It is available, you've got links to it in the documentation, but it's available at our GitHub page /extension creator. And what you can do is you can select the schema file. I know that I'm going to be working with the release schema. And I noted before that I know that I want to be using the address object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to search the definitions, and then I'm going to see where an address object actually exists in the schema. And based on my knowledge of the schema, I know that an organization often has an address. So I'm boiling down to the definition of organization. I'm looking at the properties of this object. And then I see like, oh, look, it has an address. And this is kind of how they've modeled the address. This is basically what I'm going to be trying to do and replicate here. If you're not familiar with JSON schema, like sort of don't worry. Once you've started on this and once we're finished with this demonstration, you'll kind of see how this all works. So the target file is the file that we're going to be generating. This is kind of the tool's way of providing like sort of a live working environment. So I've copied it from the source above, and I know that I'm going to be working with the tender. A common mistake when developing an OCDS extension or working with JSON schema for the first time is to look at the schema and then go at properties and then going to tender and then working here. Why this is wrong is you can see here that the tender field is actually a reference to the definition of tender. So we, instead of working here, we should be working with the definitions and of tender, and this is kind of where we're going to be doing our work. So I'm going to go to the properties. I know I need to add a new property, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to insert an object there. It's actually created it above, but it's very simple. You can just drag it down. I'm just going to put it below description, just for mostly my own pedantic reasons. And I know that this field is going to be called location. And then if we look at how fields work in JSON schema, we have to give a title for the field and then a description. And this is what's going to appear in schema documentation. And then we have to give it a reference, or we could give it properties if this was an object that we were defining ourselves. But what I'm doing here is making it an address object. So I'm just firstly going to append a string. The title of our field is the tender location. And the reason I've called it tender location is if you have a look here, a lot of the tender objects are prefixed with the word tender. So that is tender status. So we have a title for the field. And then we have a description. I'm going to be quite light just for demonstration purposes. An address or location of the tender. You should absolutely apply a more thorough description here. This is just for demonstration. And then the important bit, let's add another string. And then here, how we pull in the definition of address is we make a reference. In JSON schema, this is just with the reference command, and then we tell it where the object we're wanting to pull in and use the definition of is. And I can see from the above, it's in definitions address. So I'm literally just kind of replicating this, and then this is it. This is us. We've produced a new field in the tender object, and we have actually made it use the existing address schema that has been built into OCDS already. So this is an example of how to build using the existing OCDS building blocks. And then the tool, you can just generate the patch and it will generate the actual OCDS schema patch for you. So we can see here, this is what it's doing. If you want to have a look at the code, this is what the JSON schema actually looks like. And then we can proceed to creating it. So I'm just going to say Matt's example tender location extension. And then I'm going to give it a very brief description. Again, your description should be a little bit better. So I'm going to say it adds tender location, which is an address. And then I don't have the documentation hosted. If you had documentation hosted, this would be the URL. And then you can click generate. And then hopefully you can see that it has downloaded that zip file to my to my machine. I'm just going to open it. And this is basically, if you recall the slide that I showed you around what was underneath the hood, this is it. And then a bit of a Blue Peter moment, but this is one that I made earlier. So rather than sort of faff about with GitHub and getting it all set up because we've got limited time, I actually did exactly the same changes about half an hour ago. And then double checked it, and then a few weeks ago I sort of set up this extensions repository using the example. It's a fork of the sample schema, and then I updated it using the extensions file that we generated from the extensions creator. So this is what we're going to be using to apply to our data. And I actually have some sample data that has been set up. So we have a sample release, and it was going to add a tender location. We can see here that there is already an extension applied. It's not our extension. And we can see, let's get rid of parties. And we can see in the tender, there is no location field. So now the job is to go to the extensions, the data review tool. So let's go to the data review tool, and then let's do a thing to make it easier to work with. And just there we go. So we have sample release. Let's see that if this data is valid. So we can see that it's valid. It applies an extension. We can see that our extension is not the one that's been applied. So this is the change we're looking to see when we upload the new file. So I've also prepared sample release extended, and that is here. So if we again look down at the tender object, we can see that I've added in the location field, which is an example of the address object that we pulled in our extension, and I have declared my extension here. That would have been bad. I've declared my extension here in the extensions array. So now, when I upload that to the data review tool, that should say there are 2 valid extensions applied to the data. We have the party scale extension, which was already in there. For anyone attending the previous webinar, that is actually where that came from. And we have Matt sample tender data location extension. And then you can have a quick look at how this looks raw. So this is what's in the extension file, where it kind of like points towards all of the other things in the extensions repository. So that's it really. But now we need to determine whether the validation rules work. So let's load a new file. I've prepared a sample release extended errors file, and I'm just going to very quickly walk you through what that is. What I've done is I've again went to the tender, and I've put the location field. So this is the field that we're looking for, but I've actually made it a string when we're expecting an object. So it reads, this is not a valid location. And this is what we're going to be testing when it comes to the data review tool. So we have our errors file. We are going to be uploading it now. And great, we have failed structural tests. This is what we wanted. We'll have a look, and then we can say location is not a JSON object. It's saying that it wants an address. It's given an example, and if you're familiar with using the data review tool, this will be very familiar to you. I'm just going to, so now we've built and implemented an OCDS extension now. I'm just going to very quickly swap the sharing back so you can get a full screen view of the slides. Can anyone see just this window here? Is that all working? I'm going to presume yes, unless somebody says otherwise. So this is a reference slide in case you are using this slide deck and revisiting it. I've provided all of the sample data. You can go, it's just on Google Drive. You can grab it, you can play with it, try and break it in new and exciting ways, use it as a model for your own testing. Before we kind of move on to the larger summary, I just wanted to recap some of the key tools that we've been using. You've just seen me demonstrate the tools, but I kind of want to drive home the point that you've got this array and they all kind of work together, and making your extension as great as possible. The template repository provides a really good starting point and almost like a checklist for ensuring you've got all the elements of the extension down. Like for example, your documentation, your schema patch, etc. GitHub provides a simple way to develop and host the extension with you and your team, and so that you can collaborate on it together with us, with the rest of the community. And then the extension creator, which I demonstrated, makes it very simple to actually develop the extension. My JSON schema knowledge is it's there, it's adequate, it's not insane, but I can use the extension creator to do some quite powerful things with the OCDS schema, and like sort of using it, you can develop these like sort of patches like to introduce your new fields. You can reuse the definitions of objects very simply, like we did today, and then you can actually use it to generate your extension for you. And then finally, everyone's favorite tool, the data review tool, should then be used to review your data that you've applied an extension to. You might want to start with simple data, some sample data as we did, but then after this, apply the extension to a proper set of test data. So get a sandbox up, get a test API up, get this data coming out and being applied to a data set, and make sure it's behaving as you intend. This is particularly important if you're developing a new object definition or if you're creating new validation rules, but it's still important if you're just doing what we did and we're reusing existing building blocks. So to summarize, we're coming to the end now. OCDS extensions, they document the structure, format and meaning of additional fields and codes. And you should be creating your own extension if you need to publish data which doesn't map to either the core OCDS schema or existing extensions. You should keep in mind the 4 Ds for creating extension: discussion, development, documentation, and then demonstration and testing. And you should make the best use of the tools that we've given you. Use the extension template repository or the extension creator to develop your extension. Use them in conjunction with each other, like I do quite a lot. So now we'll kind of open up the floor. We'll answer some questions. If there's been some questions coming in, either in the chat or the notes document, I've not been paying attention to it. I've kind of relied on my illustrious colleague, Andy, to do that. And we can, if there's questions left over at the end, we tend to send them out on the mailing list as well. And also Andy would murder me if I didn't put up our post-event survey for you all to fill out before you go as well.
Thank you, Matt. That's correct. I've dropped the link to the post-event survey in the chat section. Please have a look at it. And then, Matt, we do have a question. The first question here is, do you have one JSON file that contains all the current extensions?
Okay, so let's take a look at the structure. I presume everyone can still see the screen. In fact, it might be easier if I just go through it here. So in this extension repository, you have 2 JSON files at the minute. So you have extension.json, and what this does is it contains almost like the metadata for the extension. And this is kind of almost like this is what's being read by tools, and then you are referencing which schemas that you've updated. So here you've got release schema.json, and the reason we've got this file is because this is the schema file that we edited. If we actually go to the open contracting standard repository, you can see that there are there are several schema files here, and the schema files that we have here will depend on the ones that we're editing. So you can see here we have release schema. If I was going to do something with the package level of the OCDS schema, I would also have a JSON file called release package schema.json. So there's different schema files within OCDS which really sort of provide different rules for different sort of aspects of the data standard. You only need the JSON files that you will be applying a patch to. And that might, hopefully that makes sense. If the person who asked that question could just say whether I've made sense or confused them further, that would be good, because it is a bit of a funny one to come across the first time.
All right, thank you, Matt. And we have a second question here. That the standard documentation details information about core and community extensions. Mm-hmm. When would an extension be considered core, and how would that change its treatment?
Okay, great. Great question. So a core extension, we're actually starting to move away from the language of using core extensions. But when we say a core extension, that we usually mean that it is maintained by the OCDS team, and it is subject to the same versioning and governance process as the main standard. So an extension may become core if it becomes very apparent that it is important to a lot of people, and that it's important that it is and it covers a core procurement concept. And therefore needs to be subject to the same sort of care and attention. So hopefully, I think I answered the two parts of your question in the wrong order there, but just to sort of flip it round, we can a community extension may become core if it is important enough to sort of make sure that it follows the development of the standard quite closely. If it's being used by a lot of people, if it covers an important procurement concept, and then by becoming core, it basically means that it's maintained by us. That doesn't mean that the community don't have a hand in maintaining it. They will undergo peer review, and we will accept pull requests from people. But ultimately what it means is that it becomes subject to our governance and version control. I hope that makes sense. Are there any further questions?
No, those are the two questions that we have received today. Does anyone else have any questions? I'll take that as a no, and I hope everyone has filled out our post-event survey form. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Matt for leading this technical session. We'll share all the details for this session, and the video will be posted out on YouTube. So I will send out an email with all the useful links and resources for this session. And you can always contact the help desk at data@open-contracting.org for any additional support or information that you may require in your implementation journey. Thank you. I do recognize that we've gone a few minutes, about 4 minutes over time, but I'd like to say thank you to everyone, and I'm happy to know that it was a good learning opportunity for you all. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Frandy, for putting this together. Bye-bye.